Alright everyone, just a really quick aside here. Please do join me on Daily Motion. Link is in the description of this and all other videos because I am going to begin experimenting with putting all uploads there. Like I'm going to have a playlist for the politics and news, the same as the other platforms. I'm thinking of doing that. I just need to see how long it takes to actually upload that content. Literally this morning and sort of see what happens. I'm already in the top 6,000 uploaders on Daily Motion almost effortlessly, so I would like to be in the top tier there. It'd be nice to have another major presence where it'd be hard for them to justify, abusing me or something. We've got to talk about the generic congressional ballot, because for a long time, the Democrats were up by considerable amounts. I think the highest was 13 points, or it might have been higher than that. That was a long time ago. Since then, the Republicans reversed some of that damage, but really the closest prior that they had been reliably is like 4.5 points down, which means that even differential turnout doesn't give them a boost high enough to actually be technically the winners. The best they could hope for is that they narrowly retain the House, break even, maybe gain a Senate seat or two. They're now down by less than 4 points, the Republicans are. This is the worst metric that has existed in the congressional generic ballot for the Democrats since they began polling in this cycle. And it's still moving in the Republicans' direction. Based on the polling, it's probably closer to 2.5 or 3 down for the Republicans. That's basically a dead heat. That's within the margin of error, number one, and number two, they're almost certain to have higher turnout. At that point, they probably get more votes overall than the Democrats in a plurality of the races. In which case, yeah, they retain the House, they gain several seats in the Senate. Look, the map of the Senate has 6 potential very vulnerable Democrats that could get knocked off. If McCaskill loses, there are about 3 other vulnerable Democrats that are likely, because they're less popular, to get knocked off. The Republicans may gain a net 3 or 4 seats in the Senate. That's actually a considerable victory. In governor's races, the map favors them to some degree. At that point, they'd probably do well there. Now, this is the generic congressional ballot, but that does transfer over. This is a proper metric for the popularity of the party at large. The generic totally stand-in, amorphous, any Democrat here versus any Republican here. Trump's approval is definitely playing a role, and I can tell you, I know what's causing these numbers to draw closer together. It could be that the Republicans are ahead by the time of the midterms. Then it'd be a blowout. You'd have a red wave. You wouldn't have a blue wave, in the Senate especially. What I think is happening is twofold. I think it's a combination of foreign policy from Trump and the economy. Now, the economy more trickles down to the whole party that's in charge as a total. As far as foreign policy, that's generally executive, but it does shine down on the Republicans a little bit. And as we saw in Ohio, Trump shows up, and all of a sudden a race that the Democrats were heavily slated to win. O'Connor was considerably ahead in the last round of polling. Trump shows up at the 11th hour, they pull off a thin victory. If he had shown up 2 or 3 more times, probably would have won by 3 or 4 points. In all honesty, the Trump effect is real, and it's not a negative effect. That's my personal reading of it. Trump is the strength of the Republicans. Look, the rest of the party is, who are the rest of the leaders? People like Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. Other than Rand Paul, you don't really have many people that could rise up as standard bearers within the Republicans. That includes even like the vice president. At some points in history, whoever's in charge of the executive branch, the vice president takes on a big role. We haven't seen that in quite a while. Like Dick Cheney was a no-show. Joe Biden occasionally came out and did stuff, but he was more of a charismatic, sort of friendly figure, at least, for the millennial liberals, I suppose. Maybe not for Gen Z, if you know what I'm talking about. Pence has been largely a no-show, except in some foreign policy theaters, like when he went to Korea. I think that this will continue to narrow, and it'll probably stay fairly narrow. And we have seen it before. There has been a near convergence before, but we also got another poll within this cycle that showed a dead tie. We haven't, I believe, seen a dead tie in any poll before. And if you look at the polls being aggregated, the 2 oldest ones are still showing a 7-point Democratic gain over the Republicans. Those 2 polls are going to be replaced with more recent polls at some point. It's likely that they'll show a 2 or 3 point lead for the Democrats in line with the rest. In which case that number will fall further. It'll be like 2.5 points ahead of the Republicans. That is a dead heat. In fact, it's advantage Republicans when you consider turnout differentials, probably. YouGov is the most recent. That shows a 3-point gap. I trust it. In all honesty, single polls shouldn't be trusted on their own unless corroborated and in line with the aggregate, but YouGov is the most accurate from the last election. The two most accurate were YouGov/Economist polls and Rasmussen. Rasmussen was accurate because their polling methodology, which is skewed towards Republicans, reflected turnout. YouGov was accurate for other reasons. They simply, I guess they have a good polling methodology. If YouGov says that the Republicans are only 3 points behind, when they were 8 points behind a couple of fucking weeks ago, that's a pretty good indicator of what direction things are moving in. I think it's mainly economic. You've got high consumer confidence. You've got a roaring economy. You've got massive amounts of growth, lowered unemployment. The Trump economy is here. Now, he's constantly touting it, and he's right to do so. I predicted he'd be a money president. People constantly are talking about how the sky is just about to fall, like, oh, the bubble's going to hit soon. Now, the economy will collapse soon. Well, Krugman thought it would collapse the day after Election Day, and that didn't actually happen. What happened is the stock market began to roar ahead even faster, and now we're approaching 5% GDP growth. That really, really helps, and I'm going to tell you, one group it really helps with, the economic money side, is sort of the blue dog Democrat Rust Belt. Areas that would be blue except for economic reasons, and they're like, well, Trump is better with money. As far as I know, it would be difficult to conduct a poll in which you found that anything other than a supermajority of Americans prefer the Republicans to manage the economy right now, considering all economic markers. And it's funny, for the first year they tried to give Obama credit, and then that one time that the stock market shuddered, they immediately said, well, now the Trump economy is kicked in. Well, then let's hold them to it. The Trump economy's already kicked in. So Trump is the one doing these things. It's definitely helping the down-ballot Republicans. It's going to help him in 2020. Look, if the economy keeps growing at this rate and everything goes fine, it's going to be very difficult for them to keep up the fake outrage of bigotry. Because he's not doing anything bigoted. The New York Times came out the other day, and their big thing about Nuremberg, there was, well, Trump refuses to condemn racism or something. And it's like, yeah, so he condemns racism and hate, but he didn't specifically target one group to the exclusion of every other. This is a problem. Yeah, the press is collapsing in this country because these groups don't do journalism anymore. CNN, Wall Street Journal, BuzzFeed, Vox, Salon. None of them do journalism anymore. Like, they're not going to talk about the generic ballot. They talk about polls when they're bad for Donald Trump. But if they are anything else, including sometimes bad for certain Republicans, they won't talk about it. They simply won't report. They don't want you knowing. That's really what it boils down to. No, we've seen it before. Like, they'll talk about polls endlessly. Every headline will be, well, poll shows Trump is impeached. Shows Trump down 5 points from last week. Headline news everywhere. If a poll shows him up 5 points, it's never going to make it, even if it's the same polling firm. It's actually hilarious how that works. Meanwhile, Trump does the opposite, and whatever poll shows him at the highest level in any given cycle is the one that he tweets out. I mean, he does the same thing, in all honesty. Ironically enough, the ones that are at that upper limit are closer to the aggregate totals, usually, than the ones that the legacy media fixates on. I mean, it's hilarious. Reality at this point within politics is skewed towards the Republicans heavily. It simply is. You don't need to be a Republican to see that. When you look at the generic ballot, and the Democrats go from being 8 or 9 points ahead to being less than 4 points ahead in 2 weeks' time, that shows considerable movement. And it's an aggregated total. It's not even just, well, you know, Gallup's rolling poll here week to week shows a drop. Well, that's not an aggregate. I don't really give a fuck what Gallup says. In fact, I really wouldn't even aggregate Gallup at this point because it's been so far off the aggregated sort of median so many times. And it's always unidirectional, that it's got to have some systemic bias. That's what I believe. Same is true of like Rasmussen and CNN and MSNBC. Some of these less significant polls, like they do polling more sporadically. YouGov and Reuters and some of these groups do it on a regular basis every week or two. Economist is the best, has been the closest, it seems, to the mark consistently. If they say Trump's approval is 44, I'm going to assume it's pretty close to 44. It's within a deviation of that number almost certainly, and lo and behold, it almost is within that of the aggregated total. So we need to keep watching this, especially through this month. You got to understand one other thing. Right now, the most vulnerable Senate Democrats that are up, those infamous 6, those individuals, because they are incumbents, cannot campaign this month. They don't have recess. McConnell cut their recess. But their challengers are going all over the place campaigning right now. An extra month of campaigning for those people. And there's one incumbent and vulnerable Republican that's similarly affected. As far as I know, she's having money pumped left and right into her campaign to help her overcome that fact. The RNC is like, okay, well, we need this maneuver desperately, and there is actual obstruction. We'll just cut you $1 million and call it even. How about that? And that would be a pretty good scenario for her. I think she'll probably maintain her spot. McCaskill, though, at this point, McCaskill may very well be the big Democrat that gets cut loose. It could actually happen. And then, meanwhile, along with that, remember, we've still got the fracas in California, where Feinstein and then, De Leon there are sparring, because they have a jungle primary, so it's Democrat versus Democrat. Now, Feinstein will win, but she lost the support of the party at large in California. She feels bitter, and I'm sure he feels bitter too, because he's got all of these neoliberals that are piling on her campaign. So it's a very interesting scenario. We need to watch the margin in California, despite the fact that a Democrat will win that race. We need to watch that because it's a good indicator of the support relatively for the neoliberals / Blue Dogs, which is Feinstein, versus the New Left progressives, which is De Leon. Even if he himself is not like an Ocasio-Cortez, he's a stand-in for that. He's younger. He is further left. Feinstein's ancient. She's in her mid-80s. She's probably demented. If what she says and believes in over the last decade is any indicator, she's already fucked up in the head. She's probably getting dementia meds from that secret pharmacy in D.C. That's about all. Peace out.